I was in an industrial district just outside of Seoul not too long ago, and I was expecting, that typical quiet you get in the Korean countryside.
The usual homogeneous feel.
Exactly. But I was standing outside this convenience store right near the factory gates, and the whole atmosphere was just jarringly different. A whistle blew for a shift change, and the street just flooded with young workers.
Right.
And what struck me wasn't the size of the crowd, it was the sound. I actually closed my eyes for a second, and I didn't hear Korean.
What did you hear?
It was this chaotic, vibrant mix of Vietnamese, Uzbek, Tagalog. And these weren't just, temporary visitors. They were families, teenagers in school uniforms, buying groceries, laughing. It felt permanent.
Like a real settled community.
Yeah, it felt less like the old hermit kingdom and, I don't know, more like a neighborhood in Queens or London. And it turns out that scene isn't an anomaly anymore. It's the new national reality.
It really is. The government just released a landmark set of statistics that confirms exactly what you saw on the ground.
A massive demographic turning point. For the very first time in its history, the number of people with a migrant background in South Korea has officially crossed the 5% threshold.
1 in every 20 people.
1 in 20. And in demographics, that 5% figure it's the critical tipping point, right? The moment a nation is no longer a monoculture.
That's the theory. It's the point where you officially enter the era of a multicultural society. While the world was focused on Korea's low birth rates, this completely different silent transformation was already happening.
It's an incredibly powerful moment. The data is really just catching up to the reality.
And it demands a fundamental reevaluation of everything. Korean identity, social structures, policy. It's not just a statistic, It's a seismic shift in the country's DNA.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have this hard data from Statistics Korea and the Ministry of Justice, and it confirms what people are seeing. For decades, Korea prided itself on being, and often isolated itself on being, an ethnically pure nation. To cross this 5% barrier is to publicly acknowledge that era is, it's over. I want to start with the sheer magnitude of the change, because 5% on its own, it doesn't sound like a huge number. But the context here is absolutely everything. Can you confirm the official factor and explain how the government is actually defining this migrant background population?
Yeah, we need to be really precise here because the definition itself tells a story. The official number from the National Data Office is 2.715 million people. That was as of November 2023.
Go.
And that works out to exactly 5.24% of the total population. But the crucial thing, like you said, is who's in that number. It goes far beyond just temporary workers. It's a really holistic view.
So it's not just people on work visas?
No, not at all. It's designed to capture the true breadth of the social change. It includes 3 distinct groups. First, you have your long-term foreign residents, so anyone in Korea for 3 months or more.
Okay, standard enough.
Second, naturalized citizens. And third, and this is the really important one for the future, second-generation immigrants.
So children born in Korea?
To at least one foreign-born parent. Exactly. And including naturalized citizens and the second generation confirms this is a structural generational change. It's permanent settlement, not just labor rotation.
That inclusion of the second generation, that's the key, isn't it? It moves the conversation from visa management to full-scale social integration.
Yeah, it has to.
But the real urgency, the data point that should honestly stop every policymaker in their tracks, is that growth rate comparison. What does the data show when we compare how quickly this group is growing versus the overall Korean population?
This contrast is, I think, maybe the single most important economic takeaway from the whole data set. It just highlights the failure of Korea's demographic engine.
And its reliance on migration.
It's increasing reliance, yeah. Look at the numbers. In a single year, the migrant background population grew by a pretty significant 5.2%.
5.2%.
Now you look at the other side of the ledger. The total population, so that's native Koreans plus all these new residents, it only increased by a tiny 0.1% in the same period.
So wait, that 5.2% growth from the migrant population is basically the only thing keeping the national population statistics from going negative.
It's the only thing keeping it above water.
Yes.
Without this cohort, the country would be in an outright demographic freefall.
So the growth of the native population is stagnant? Shrinking?
It's stagnant or shrinking in many areas. So that 5.2% growth isn't just masking the decline. It is driving virtually all of the net population increase the country is experiencing right now. This isn't just about filling a few gaps anymore. These new residents are structurally supporting the economy and the tax base of the future.
So who are these people? Who are the faces behind the figures? Is it still mostly short-term labor, or are we seeing that swell in citizens and children you mentioned?
It's still weighted toward foreign nationals for now, but the trajectory is absolutely pointing toward long-term settlement. Foreign nationals make up the biggest piece of the pie, about 75.2%. That's just over 2 million people. But the figure we really need to focus on for long-term, the one that puts immense pressure on social systems like education, is the second generation.
Right.
They account for 14% of this cohort. That's about 381,000 individuals, and that group is just rising so rapidly. This is a cohort of children that will need massive, immediate investment in tailored social and educational support if they're going to integrate successfully.
And when you look at the age distribution, it's not just growing. It's exactly the young, active labor that the rapidly aging native population needs so desperately. It really does sound like a critical economic boost.
It's a literal lifeline for the economy.
Yeah.
Look at the data. A remarkable 81.9% of this migrant-background population is in the prime working age bracket of 15 to 64.
82%.
Their age structure is completely different from the native Korean population, which is, as we know, graying incredibly fast. The biggest age groups within this new population are people in their 30s, then their 20s, then their 40s.
Big productivity years.
Peak decades for productivity, for tax contributions, and critically, for filling those manufacturing and service jobs that native Koreans are increasingly avoiding. Without this injection of young labor, the projections for Korea's future GDP and pension sustainability would be significantly grimmer.
And this shift isn't spread out evenly across the country, which I think probably explained a lot of the social friction we're starting to see. Where is this population concentrated?
That geographic concentration is the absolute heart of the social and political challenge. Over half, 56.8%, is crammed into the metropolitan area. So Seoul, Gyeonggi-do, and Incheon.
Puts a lot of pressure on urban infrastructure.
Immense pressure. But you also see these extreme concentrations in specific industrial hotspots. Take a place like Yeongam, down in South Jeolla province. It has the massive Daebul industrial complex.
Okay.
An astounding 21.1% of its total population is now designated as migrant background.
A fifth of the population.
Exactly. So in places like Yeongam or Ansan, this change isn't some national statistic you read about the news. It's the daily lived reality of the neighborhood. It's impacting housing, schools, basic services on a scale that, frankly, national policy often fails to address properly.
Let's pivot to the economic drivers here. We know manufacturing and agriculture are struggling for labor. So where specifically are these hundreds of thousands of employed foreigners working?
The labor market figures make it really clear. This population is overwhelmingly focused on essential, physically demanding sectors. The number of employed foreigners hit 923,000 in 2023.
Almost a million.
And their employment is heavily skewed away from white-collar jobs. It's toward sectors the native labor force is shunning because of, difficult working conditions, low social prestige, long hours. The two sectors that saw the biggest jump in employment for this group were mining and manufacturing and agriculture, forestry, and fishing.
The foundational economy.
The absolute bedrock. These industries provide the output that fuels the high-tech exports, but they are perpetually on the brink of labor collapse.
And for the workers themselves, it sounds like the motivation is almost purely transactional. They're chasing high wages, not necessarily drawn by a long-term desire to integrate, at least not at first.
Precisely. For those on the crucial E-9 non-professional employment visa, the number one reason they give for choosing Korea is high wages. That's 72.2% of respondents.
Right.
Compared to typical wages in their home countries, we're talking Nepal, Cambodia, Vietnam, the Korean wage is a massive economic opportunity. It's often several times higher.
But that transactional nature doesn't mean they're safe.
No, not at all. This group is highly vulnerable. Alarmingly, 3.2% of foreign wage workers reported getting injured while working, and they often cite making a mistake as the cause.
Which suggests what? A training issue? Language barriers?
It suggests systemic issues. It could be safety training. It could be language barriers preventing them from understanding dangerous industrial processes, or just the inherent risk and fatigue that comes with the heavy industrial jobs they're doing.
And we can actually see the breakdown of this essential labor force through the E-9 visa. Which countries are sending the most workers into these demanding roles?
The E-9 category is dominated by a few specific sending nations, which directly influences the cultural texture of these industrial towns. Nepal currently has the largest share.
Okay.
It's followed closely by Cambodia and Vietnam. And this concentration means that while Korea is becoming more diverse nationally, specific industrial clusters are becoming, in a sense, monocultures of non-Korean ethnic groups. It's fostering those vibrant, multilingual neighborhoods you described, but it's also creating very specific, very localized social and integration challenges.
So we've laid out the hard data. The 5% line is crossed, the economic role is vital, but now we have to confront the social consequences of this rapid, very localized shift. And this is where that sociological term, enemy, becomes so relevant. You told me about this powerful anecdote of Mr. Park, a longtime resident of Wangok-dong in Insan.
Walking down his own street. And he felt utterly disoriented. Just the sheer speed of change, the flood of Vietnamese, Uzbek, Tagalog, the foreign signs, the new spices. He said he felt like an immigrant in his own town.
And that profound feeling, that sense of being a stranger in a once familiar place, that's exactly what sociologists mean by an enemy. It's not just culture shock or feeling a bit uncomfortable. It's a deep sociological diagnosis of a society losing its structural integrity.
So it's more than just personal feeling.
Oh, much more. Durkheimian enemy is the collapse of the societal glue. It's the collective consciousness of shared, stable norms. When new populations arrive too quickly and in such high concentration, the existing norms of public conduct, of community interaction, they just evaporate. And they evaporate faster than new, inclusive rules can be established. The result is this deep disorientation, this sense of normlessness and anxiety among the long-term residents.
And it's the sheer scale of change in these hyperlocal areas that seems to be driving this enemy. In Ansan's Wangok village, for example, the change isn't gradual at all. No, it's instantaneous. It's a textbook example of hyperlocalization accelerating social fracture. In Wangok village, 2/3 of the population is non-Korean.
2/3.
When a local community crosses a boundary like that, where the majority of public interaction is happening in languages or under cultural assumptions unfamiliar to the native residents, it creates massive policy and psychological challenges. For the native residents, that sense of normlessness becomes a crisis of confidence in the community itself, and that often translates into resentment and xenophobia.
It raises a really uncomfortable question.
It does. How can a government credibly promote integration when the existing social contract is perceived by its own long-term residents as dissolving around them, just due to the sheer velocity of change?
And this personal disorientation seems to feed directly into a broader social anxiety. And critically, it seems to manifest as a reluctance to provide legislative protection for the very people Korea needs to keep here.
You see that disconnection reflected so clearly in public perception surveys. Despite all the government messaging about multiculturalism being necessary, acceptance remains worryingly low among the broader public.
Right.
Surveys consistently show that a significant minority, about 32% of Koreans, still view mixed-race families as a threat to social cohesion. This fear of internal fragmentation, it just severely inhibits any real policy progress. It reinforces the desire to maintain ethnic purity as a national ideal.
And nothing illustrates that fear or that policy failure more clearly than the persistent, just, complete absence of comprehensive anti-discrimination laws, despite all this international pressure.
That legislative gap is a glaring, dangerous vulnerability for Korea. Efforts to pass a comprehensive anti-discrimination law, one that would cover race, origin, gender, sexual orientation. They've been introduced and defeated again and again.
Why is the resistance so fierce?
It's often rooted in very specific, virulent opposition from conservative groups. They fear what they call reverse discrimination, or the erosion of traditional values, or just a flood of legal challenges. Even the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Racism has called on Korea to pass these laws. But the continued stalling means there's no clear legal standard against racism. It leaves migrants, particularly marriage migrants and vulnerable workers, socially and legally exposed.
And the mistreatment of foreign women, especially Vietnamese marriage migrants, has gotten so bad that it's actually escalated beyond a domestic issue. It's a foreign policy problem now.
This is where domestic social issues really gain international diplomatic weight. The safety and treatment of foreign women who marry Koreans are now direct diplomatic pressure points.
Human bridges, that can also be pressure points.
Exactly. We've seen instances where the Vietnamese government had to formally intervene after incidents of domestic violence and abuse came to light. They requested better protection for their citizens in Korea.
Which turns a social problem into a bilateral issue.
Right. The mistreatment of one person can suddenly sour trade talks or impede cooperation. So the Korean government has been forced to respond. They've tightened financial eligibility requirements for Korean men seeking foreign wives, explicitly trying to reduce the high poverty rate in multicultural families, and, implicitly trying to reduce the exploitation of vulnerable women.
So how has government policy evolved to deal with this tension, this pull between the economic need for integration and the public's anxiety about safety and social order?
The policy evolution reflects that acute tension. Korean policymakers have consciously looked at what they see as failures elsewhere. They've cited the declaration of failure of multiculturalism in several European countries.
You mean like in France or Germany?
Exactly. They see it as a cautionary tale. And this led to a key policy shift, particularly under the Park administration. Their second basic plan, which started in 2013, consciously introduced safety alongside integration as a core policy objective.
So safety becomes an official pillar of the multicultural policy.
Yes. The inclusion of that word safety was a direct political acknowledgement and response to Korean citizens' concerns about potential racial conflict and identity crises.
So the state is trying to offer integration services, but it's framed within the strong emphasis on security and social control. What specific programs does the Ministry of Justice have for, say, marriage migrants who are among the most vulnerable?
They have targeted programs because they recognize this group is both vulnerable and crucial for integration, since they're raising the second generation. They run an early adaptation program and, significantly, a mandatory guidance program for international marriages.
Mandatory for whom?
It's required for Koreans who are marrying residents of certain Asian countries. And what's critical is that this training includes human rights education. It's focused on conflict resolution, understanding cultural differences, and domestic violence prevention. By institutionalizing this training, the state is admitting right up front that abuse and exploitation are a systemic risk of this migration model, and it has to be proactively addressed through state-mandated education.
Let's shift our gaze now from that community anxiety to something more structural inequality, specifically for the second generation. The whole narrative of South Korea's rise has always been anchored to meritocracy. You study hard, you succeed.
The ladder of mobility.
Exactly. But for the children of migrants, that ladder seems fundamentally compromised. We have the story of Min-soo, a bright 14-year-old mixed ethnic student struggling in one of these intensely competitive academic districts. His classmates are all in high-pressure Hagwon's cram schools every evening, but he has to go home to help his mother.
His foreign-born mother.
Right.
Right.
Who struggles with all the complex Korean administrative paperwork for the school system.
Min-soo's story just perfectly illustrates how these structural barriers can turn the promise of meritocracy into a complete illusion. He doesn't lack merit or intelligence, but he lacks the crucial cultural capital and the administrative support that his native Korean peers get.
It's an entire ecosystem that he's locked out of.
Completely. The relentless Hagwon culture, the complex application processes, the need for intense parental advocacy. It all assumes that families can seamlessly navigate these things, and crucially, that they have the disposable income for it. When a child like Min-soo has to become the cultural translator and administrative assistant for his family, he loses those critical hours he needs to compete.
So he sees the system as rigged.
He perceives, correctly, that the system is rigged against him, and that renders the whole promise of equal opportunity completely meaningless.
And that structural critique of meritocracy is so important here. In theory, it should be the fairest system. It should reward only effort and talent. But in practice, it sounds like it's just a sophisticated way to justify existing social hierarchies.
The academic critique is fascinating here. It shows that modern meritocracy often functions less as an equalizer and more as a powerful ideology for justifying the existing social class hierarchy. It allows the privileged class to rationalize their success. They can say, we succeeded purely due to our own merit and hard work, and that absolves them of any responsibility for the systemic barriers that face others. They maintain their structural advantages, the networks, the inherited wealth, the superior cultural literacy, and then they attribute the inequality to the failure of the less privileged to just try harder.
So when Min-soo is excluded because his mother needs help with a form, that's the system working as designed in a way.
It's a failure that demonstrates how the system contributes to deep social inequality. We are systematically excluding a new generation of potential high achievers.
And the education sector is clearly facing an enormous challenge just from the sheer volume of these kids entering the system.
The scale is immense, and the numbers are just climbing sharply. Children and adolescents under 24 with migrant backgrounds are increasing at a staggering annual rate of 7.9%.
Oh.
That means thousands of new students entering the system every year who need specialized, comprehensive support in language, culture, social adjustment. And historically, the consequences of not providing that support were devastating. Back in 2008, you had alarmingly high rates of non-attendance. especially for older kids. Up to 70% for high school-age children from multicultural families.
70%.
Now, intense government focus has likely improved those numbers a lot, but academic attainment for multicultural youth still consistently lags behind the general population. And that means a huge portion of this young, vital demographic might never reach its full economic potential.
So what specific mechanisms is the government using to try and bridge those gaps for students like Min-Soo?
They've pivoted from a general approach to a more targeted, customized one. There's a huge focus now on expanded and customized Korean language education. They recognize that language proficiency is the absolute gateway to everything else. They also run special education institutes and, crucially, the Rainbow School system. This is overseen by the Ministry of Gender Equality and Family, and it's designed specifically for migrant youth aged 9 to 24. It helps them adjust academically and socially before they enter or re-enter the mainstream school system.
So it's like a transition program.
Exactly. And the Ministry of Education is also expanding a formalized Korean language diagnosis and correction system across all school levels to try and make sure no child is left behind just because of language.
You mentioned earlier that marriage migration was, for a long time, the single exception to Korea's restrictive immigration policy. This expedited path to citizenship was basically a utilitarian policy, right, to offset the bride shortage and low birth rates.
It was. Marriage migration became the key and often the only pathway to citizenship for many foreign nationals. It offered a highly expedited path. You could get naturalization in as little as 2 years, which is much shorter than the standard 5-year residency requirement.
And they waived exams and things?
Initially, they often waived the written culture exams. And this was a purely utilitarian policy response. It was meant to offset the declining birth rate and address the critical issue of Korean men, especially in rural areas, who were struggling to find native Korean wives. It was state engineering aimed at population replacement, not necessarily cultural integration.
But that policy had some pretty profound unintended consequences, particularly around poverty and vulnerability. The government had to tighten those requirements eventually, didn't they?
Oh, absolutely. They were forced to tighten the requirements in 2014. They started demanding proof of financial eligibility and language proficiency from the foreign spouse.
And why the change?
Because the utilitarian focus on just acquiring brides led to significant socioeconomic problems. Studies showed a disproportionately high number of these multicultural families were living in poverty, and the high rate of vulnerability and abuse among foreign wives became an international embarrassment and a diplomatic problem, like we discussed with Vietnam. So tightening the financial eligibility for the Korean men seeking foreign wives was a direct attempt to mitigate those poverty and exploitation concerns. It was a recognition that the initial laissez-faire policy had created a new underclass.
And when you look at the naturalization data, the historical dominance of this marriage path is written clearly in the gender imbalance among new citizens.
The gender imbalance is overwhelming. It just confirms the historical priority of the marriage migration pathway. Among all naturalized Koreans, a staggering 81.9% are female.
82%. It's a highly unusual pattern globally.
It is. And it meant that the new demographic, primarily women raising the second generation, often in lower income brackets, posed a unique and urgent set of policy problems related to welfare, education, and language support. And these were problems the traditional bureaucracy was just completely ill-equipped to handle.
Okay, so this demographic pivot from a homogenous society to one that has to manage these diverse permanent populations. It requires a massive bureaucratic overhaul. Before we get into the current structures, how has Korea's immigration policy and the research that tracks it evolved over the last couple of decades?
The policy evolution maps almost perfectly onto the accelerating social changes. It's moved from reactive management to trying to be proactive integration. Academic research confirms a very clear trend. If you go back to the Roe administration in the early 2000s, the policy focus was extremely narrow. It was centered almost entirely on the human rights and welfare of married female immigrants.
So that was when the first legal frameworks for multicultural families were built.
Exactly, and they were built hastily.
And how did that scope broaden under the next administrations?
Under the Lee administration, from 2008 to 2012, the focus began to broaden significantly beyond just marriage. It expanded to address emerging social issues like crime and xenophobia. And critically, this is when the Foundational Refugee Act was enacted in 2012, formally acknowledging a totally different class of migrant.
Right. And then under the Moon administration.
Social integration policies really took center stage. This was heavily influenced by the 2018 Jeju-Yemeni refugee crisis, which forced policy research to focus deeply on asylum and social acceptance issues. The overall trend is a clear, forced progression from viewing migrants as temporary labor or spouses to viewing them as permanent residents who need comprehensive social integration.
This is where it gets really interesting on the governance side. The outline points to a complex, fragmented system with multiple ministries involved. Why is it so fragmented, and what kind of problems does that create on the ground?
The system is inherently fragmented because migration just impacts every single facet of national life: labor, family, security, borders, education, finance. Historically, as each problem came up, a labor shortage, marriage, migrant abuse, youth integration, a different ministry was tasked with creating an ad hoc solution.
Creating these bureaucratic silos.
Exactly. So policy implementation is currently spread across numerous powerful agencies, and that leads to significant overlap, data that doesn't match up, and a constant lack of coordinated strategic planning. It is governance by reaction, not by design.
Can you give us a quick breakdown of who handles what in this fragmented system?
It's complex, and the roles often overlap. You have the Ministry of Justice, the MOJ. They're the primary gatekeepers, handling borders, visas, and critical social integration programs. Then there's the Ministry of Employment and Labor, MOEL, which manages the labor market, especially the crucial employment permit system. Then the Ministry of Gender Equality and Family, MOGEF, focuses heavily on multicultural families and youth support, running things like the Rainbow School. And finally, the Ministry of Strategy and Finance, MOSF, gets involved when the goal is attracting high-skilled talent.
So a single migrant family might have to deal with 3 or 4 different ministries.
All of whom have different priorities and different data systems. It's a bureaucratic nightmare for that.
It sounds like the country is running on 2 parallel migration tracks. A really strict one for low-skilled labor and a very welcoming one for elite talent.
That's precisely the dual-track system. There is universal political consensus on aggressively courting excellent foreign workers. The Ministry of Strategy and Finance actively supports attracting this elite talent through specialized visas, special naturalization programs. They use scoring systems to quantify an applicant's potential contribution.
A global competition for human capital.
Exactly. Meanwhile, low-skilled migration through that E9 visa remains heavily restricted, temporary, and focused purely on filling labor shortages, often with a very limited path to long-term residency or citizenship.
Given this fragmentation, the government must be planning to centralize authority. What's the path toward a unified system?
That is the clear, recognized future direction. Everyone acknowledges the current system is unsustainable. The Ministry of Justice has outlined ambitious plans to establish a centralized authority for migration, basically trying to create a single overarching entity, like a dedicated immigration service.
And what about the data problem?
They intend to integrate and manage all the foreigner data that's currently scattered across those multiple agencies by 2024. This move is critical. Right now, the right hand, the MOJ, often doesn't know what the left hand, the MOEL, is doing with a worker's status. It makes policy formulation impossible. This centralization signals that they recognize a permanent migrant population needs coordinated, strategic management.
Let's dig a bit deeper into the bedrock of that low-skilled labor migration. The Employment Permit System, or EPS. We know it's crucial, but what is its structure? How is it different from the older, often exploitative systems?
The EPS, which was set up in 2004, is a legal framework that lets small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs, legally hire non-professional foreign workers on that E9 visa when they can't find native labor.
And the key difference from the old industrial trainee system.
The crucial difference is that it treats them as legal workers, not as trainees. That means they're protected under Korean labor laws. They're entitled to minimum wage, standard labor rights, industrial accident compensation insurance.
But the system is still designed to be temporary.
Yes. It limits a worker's total stay and often restricts their ability to change employers, which keeps them heavily dependent on the labor ministry and the employer's goodwill.
That restriction on changing employers has to create specific vulnerabilities, even with legal protections.
It creates a massive power imbalance. The inability to easily transfer employers, while it's intended to prevent labor instability, it inadvertently makes workers vulnerable to abuse. It forces them to tolerate poor working conditions for fear of being deported or losing their visa status. The system is still fundamentally focused on short-term labor circulation, not long-term integration.
Even though the reality is many are staying long term.
Exactly. Even though the reality, as we saw with the 5.24% figure, is that many are now staying.
And what about integration services for those people trying to manage work, family, and acculturation all at once? I mean, daytime classes are an option for factory workers.
But the Ministry of Justice has actually shown some innovation here. They've recognized this scheduling constraint. They offer real-time online video education and special night and weekend classes specifically for foreign workers and conversation instructors who can't participate during normal work hours.
So the bureaucracy is trying to flex a little.
It's a crucial adaptation. It shows they're attempting to meet the reality of immigrant life, which is often defined by long, demanding shifts in industrial sectors.
And finally, we noted that this localized concentration means national policy needs local support. How are local governments like Ansan cities stepping up to address that hyper-local friction?
Local governments are on the front lines, and their activism is vital. National policy is just too broad to address a place where 66% of a neighborhood is non-Korean. Ansan City is a major hotspot, and it's developed these essential hyperlocal services. This includes comprehensive language classes, critical legal advice on visas and employment, and producing multilingual guides to help people navigate local life, like tenancy rules and school enrollment. This local effort acts as a crucial buffer, providing immediate practical support that can reduce that daily disorientation for everyone.
We've dissected the data, the social friction, the structural barriers, the fragmented policy. Now we get to the most profound, the most existential challenge, redefining what it even means to be Korean. For centuries, that national identity was rooted in ethno-nationalism, a single, pure bloodline. How does a society built on that foundation pivot to accommodate 5.24% new Koreans without fracturing?
It requires a monumental ideological transformation. It's a shift from the ethnic genealogical model of national identity to what we call the civic territorial model.
Explain that difference.
The traditional model defines citizenship and belonging through ancestry, through bloodline. It links your identity to a specific singular heritage. The civic model, in contrast, defines citizenship through adherence to shared constitutional values, democratic principles, legal systems. Regardless of your ethnicity or origin, Korea has to make this ideological transition, and fast, to remain a viable, cohesive, modern democracy. Failure risks perpetual internal division.
This struggle to be recognized based on civic commitment rather than ancestry is intensely personal for many, even for people who are ethnically Korean. We look at the story of Jinna, the North Korean defector. Technically, she's Korean.
Right.
But her accent, her unfamiliarity with Southern culture, her background, it immediately marks her as other. And she champions defining Korean by constitutional values because she's tired of being reduced to this simplistic, pity-inducing label of the suffering defector.
Jinna's experience is so important because it highlights that the current system imposes this ethnic and cultural sorting, even within the category of citizen. If a constitutionally recognized citizen struggles to be accepted for her civic contribution and instead gets categorized by her trauma or origin, imagine the challenge for someone who is clearly foreign-born.
So her call for a shared civic identity is?
It's the necessary ideological antidote to the rise of divisive identity politics and tribal fracturing. If the society fails to elevate a common set of universally shared democratic values, groups will inevitably retreat into competing based on ethnic grievance and tribal loyalty. And that leads to internal conflict.
We've actually seen this ideological shift codified in one of the most tradition-bound Korean institutions, one that is central to male civic identity, the military. That must have been a profound symbolic move.
It was an extremely powerful symbolic decoupling of ethnicity and citizenship. In 2012, the military service law was formally changed. The original language of the military oath was dropped, specifically removing the phrase "serving the nation and ethnicity."
And what was it replaced with?
It was replaced with the more inclusive, more civic phrase, "serving the nation and its citizens." This officially recognized a multi-ethnic military, ensuring all male citizens, regardless of their ethnic background, must perform mandatory service. This is the state consciously declaring that service and national commitment supersede bloodline.
And the growth of this population translates directly into new political voices. We're moving from a silent minority to a de facto interest group that politicians just can't afford to ignore anymore.
That is the inevitable political maturation of this change. As the naturalized population grows, political participation evolves. The first generation of new citizens might initially vote based on their spouse's preference or community leaders, but the communities they form, the the Filipino community, the Vietnamese community, they become established, organized interest groups.
And they start making demands.
They start demanding political representation, tailored policies, and attention from major political parties who are eager for new voting blocs as the native population ages. The future dynamism of Korean democracy absolutely relies on ensuring these new Koreans, especially the second generation, can fully exercise their political rights.
The election of Jasmine Lee in 2012 was a major milestone in that. It shattered a glass ceiling.
Jasmine Lee, originally from the Philippines and a former marriage migrant herself, became the first naturalized Korean to get a seat in the National Assembly in 2012. Her election was hailed internationally as a defining moment for political inclusion.
And her role wasn't just symbolic.
No, her mandated goal was explicit: to develop a working roadmap for multiculturalism in Korea. She was tasked with forcing policy adaptation from within the highest levels of the legal and political system. She is a tangible example of how demographic change creates new vectors for political leadership.
Let's zoom out to the geopolitical implications. How does this multi-ethnic reality impact the central, long-held national goal of peninsular unification? That goal has always been seen through the lens of a single, pure Korean people.
It introduces a massive ideological challenge to the historical basis of unification. Unification has traditionally been envisioned based on Minjok, the ethnic nation,
Right.
and a pure bloodline. North Korea, which operates under an extreme state-propagated ethno-nationalism, actively condemns the South as mongrelized, precisely because of its increasing diversity.
So any path to unification has to change its rationale.
It has to. It must fundamentally shift the rationale from ethnic purity to a foundation of shared civic and democratic values. If the goal remains ethnic purity, the process will be immediately poisoned by race-based conflicts and ideological incompatibility with the South's reality.
South Korea also has to manage these complex diplomatic tightropes with its powerful neighbors, like China, regarding ethnic Koreans of Chinese nationality, the Joseon-job.
The China context is highly nuanced and a constant geopolitical concern. Seoul has to be extremely wary of Beijing's reactions to any policies concerning the Joseon-job. These migrants are treated with a very specific, preferential status, almost like distant kin compared to other migrants.
You get special visas.
They get special visas like the H-2. However, their political and social integration has to be handled with extreme delicacy to avoid angering China or creating a situation where Beijing feels its sovereignty is being challenged. This geopolitical reality directly influences the preferential, yet sometimes restrictive, treatment these migrants receive.
Finally, we see these new Koreans acting as human bridges, mediating foreign relations, especially with key labor-sending countries like the Philippines and Vietnam. It turns domestic policy into an international opportunity.
That is the ultimate positive diplomatic potential of this shift. The treatment of citizens from the Philippines and Vietnam and Korea becomes a direct, measurable factor in bilateral relations and trade. Mistreatment can lead to pressure points, as we saw with Vietnam. Conversely, shared figures like Jasmine Lee facilitate stronger cultural exchange, teacher exchanges, deeper trade ties. It demonstrates that this demographic dynamism, if it's managed proactively, can actually strengthen Korea's soft power and global relevance.
This has been a fascinating deep dive. It reveals how crossing that 5% statistical threshold has translated into these immediate, profound social and political challenges that Korea is really struggling to manage.
It's a silent revolution, truly. That 5% threshold is so much more than a number. It's a fundamental challenge to these deeply held notions of ethnic identity, social coherence, and the perceived fairness of the meritocracy itself. The nation is currently living in the gap between its ethnic past and its multicultural future.
And it seems the structural policy interventions are absolutely necessary to close that gap.
Indeed, the necessity of those interventions is undeniable. This means consciously fostering that shared civic identity, ensuring educational support truly closes the attainment gap for kids like Min-soo, and establishing those non-negotiable legal safeguards like comprehensive anti-discrimination laws to prevent social fracture and alienation.
South Korea has clearly reached a critical juncture.
It has. This demographic dynamism provides South Korea with a unique and existential opportunity. It's not just offset declining birth rates and sustain its labor market. It's an opportunity to fundamentally strengthen its democracy and its global relevance by consciously building a new, more inclusive model of Koreanness, one based on shared constitutional commitment and civic responsibility, rather than the increasingly fragile concept of an ancestral bloodline.